What if the only voice that could save a condemned horse was one that had never spoken aloud? A dark brown stallion stood in a kill pen, hours from execution. Every trainer had failed. Every method had been exhausted. Then a 6-year-old boy, who'd never heard a sound in his life, stepped forward, and what happened in the silence between them would shatter every assumption about communication, connection, and what it truly means to be heard. This is a story about finding understanding in the quietest of places. If you believe in the power of silent communication and unbreakable bonds, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us share more stories of hope and extraordinary connection. The kill pens of Raleigh County exist in a space between mercy and cruelty, a gray zone where economics and emotion collide in the harshest possible way. They sit on the outskirts of town, tucked behind a commercial feedlot, where the air hangs thick with the smell of manure and diesel fuel. The pens are small, crowded, built from weathered railroad ties and rusted panels that have seen decades of frightened animals pass through. This is where horses come to die. Not the valuable ones, not the champions or the beloved family pets. These are the used up, the unwanted, the ones deemed too dangerous or too broken or simply too expensive to keep. They arrive in livestock trailers, their eyes wide with confusion and terror, and they leave in refrigerated trucks bound for processing plants across the border. It is a brutal business, made more brutal by its necessity in a world where horses are both loved and disposable. The stallion had no name on his intake papers, just a number, a brief physical description, and a single word stamped in red ink across the top of the form. Dangerous. He was dark brown, almost the color of rich soil after rain, with a black mane that fell thick and tangled across his neck. His coat was dull, matted with mud and old sweat. His hooves were cracked and overgrown, but beneath the neglect, you could see what he'd once been. The powerful chest, the elegant head, the way he carried himself even in this degraded place spoke of bloodlines and training, of a past when he'd been worth something to someone. He'd been seized from a hoarding situation 3 counties over, pulled from a property where 40 horses had been kept in conditions that made the kill pen look humane. Most of those horses had been rehabilitated and adopted out. But this stallion had proven impossible. He'd attacked 2 veterinarians during the initial evaluation. He'd broken through 3 separate enclosures. He'd kicked a volunteer so hard, she'd spent a week in the hospital with a shattered femur. The rescue organization had tried for 6 months, exhausting their resources and their patience. Finally, they'd made the hardest call. Some horses, they decided, were too far gone. Some damage couldn't be undone. The execution was scheduled for Friday afternoon. Today was Thursday. Jack Pugsley ran the kill pen operation with a tired efficiency born of 2 decades in a job that slowly ate away at the soul. He was 53 years old, weathered and quiet, with hands scarred from rope burns and eyes that had seen too much suffering. He didn't enjoy this work. He simply understood that someone had to do it, and he did it as humanely as the business allowed. He made sure the animals had water. He tried to keep them calm, and when their time came, he made it quick. It was the only kindness he could offer. He stood outside the stallion's pen on Thursday morning, a clipboard in his hand, reviewing the veterinary release forms one last time. The horse stood at the far end of the enclosure, his back to the gate, his body rigid with tension. Even motionless, he radiated violence. Jack had seen thousands of horses come through here, and he'd learned to read them. This one wasn't mean. He was terrified. Fear and aggression were often impossible to distinguish, especially in prey animals whose only defense was flight or fight. This stallion had been trapped, beaten by circumstances until flight was no longer an option. So he fought. He fought everything and everyone because it was the only power he had left. Jack sighed and clipped the papers back on his board. Tomorrow morning, the vet would come with the injection. The stallion would get a sedative first, enough to drop him to his knees, and then the final dose that would stop his heart. It would take less than 5 minutes, and then he'd be gone, and Jack would move on to the next pen, the next animal, the next small tragedy in an endless line of them. He was turning to leave when he heard the voices, a woman and a child, coming around the corner of the barn. Jack frowned. The kill pens weren't open to the public. The rescue organizations knew better than to bring civilians back here, especially children. The last thing anyone needed was a traumatized kid having nightmares about horses being put down. The woman was in her 30s, thin and tired-looking, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. She carried herself with a wary determination that Jack recognized. She was poor, probably working 2 jobs, probably living in one of the trailer parks on the south end of town. The kind of person who'd been beaten down by life but refused to stay down. The boy walking beside her was small, maybe 6 years old, dressed in denim overalls and a white short-sleeved shirt that was slightly too big for his frame. His hair was blonde, almost white in the morning sun, cut short and neat. He walked with a careful precision, his eyes scanning everything around him with intense focus. "Ma'am, this area is restricted," Jack called out, moving to intercept them. "You need to head back to the main office." The woman stopped, but she didn't look apologetic. She looked determined. "I'm here about the brown stallion, the one scheduled for tomorrow." Jack's frown deepened. "That horse isn't available for adoption. He's been deemed unsuitable for placement. I'm sorry, but the decision's been made." "I want to see him," she said, and there was steel in her voice. "Just see him, 5 minutes, please." "Ma'am, he's dangerous. He's injured multiple people. I can't let you or your son anywhere near him." "We won't go in the pen," she said. "We'll stay outside the fence, but my son needs to see him. Please, I'm not asking for much, just 5 minutes." Jack looked at the boy who was watching the conversation with those intense, focused eyes. There was something different about him, though Jack couldn't quite identify what. The way he stood, perhaps, or the way he didn't react to the voices around him. Just watched. "Why?" Jack asked finally. "Why do you need to see him?" The woman hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "My son is deaf. He's been deaf since birth, and he has this connection with animals, especially horses. I can't explain it, but I've seen it. He understands them in ways I don't. When he heard about this horse, when I told him about it, he signed to me that he needed to help. I know how that sounds. I know you probably think I'm crazy, but I'm asking you, as a mother, to give us 5 minutes. That's all." Jack studied her face, looking for signs of delusion or fanaticism. He found only desperation and a mother's stubborn love. He looked at the boy again, and the kid looked back at him with eyes that seemed older than they should be. Finally, against his better judgment, Jack nodded. 5 minutes, he said. "You stay outside the fence. You don't make any sudden movements, and if that horse charges, you run. Understood?" "Understood," the woman said. She signed something to her son, her hands moving in quick, fluid gestures. The boy nodded once. Jack led them to the stallion's pen, positioning them at the corner where the horse couldn't easily charge the fence if he decided to attack. The stallion was still standing at the far end, his back to them, his tail swishing in agitation. "That's him," Jack said quietly. "Tomorrow morning at 9, the vet comes. That's all the time he's got left." The woman knelt beside her son, signing to him, explaining something Jack couldn't understand. The boy watched her hands, nodded, then turned his attention to the horse. For a long moment, nothing happened. The world continued around them. A truck rumbled past on the highway. Birds called from the cottonwood trees. The wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like whispered secrets. Then the boy did something that made Jack's breath catch. He moved forward, right up to the fence, and he placed his small hands on the metal rail. His eyes never left the stallion. He didn't call out, didn't make any sound. He just stood there, absolutely still, looking at the horse with an intensity that seemed to fill the space around him. The stallion's ear flicked, just one ear, rotating back toward the fence where the boy stood. Then the other ear followed. Slowly, with visible reluctance, the horse turned his head. He looked over his shoulder at the small figure at the fence, and their eyes met. Something passed between them. Jack, who'd been working with animals his entire life, felt it even if he couldn't name it. A recognition, an understanding. The stallion turned fully around and took one step toward the fence, then another. His movements were cautious, testing, but there was no aggression in them. He approached the way a wild animal might approach water in a drought, drawn by need but wary of danger. The boy didn't move. He didn't reach out, didn't try to touch the horse. He just stood there, his hands on the fence, his gaze steady and unwavering. The stallion came closer until he was standing just on the other side of the rails, close enough that Jack could see the rapid rise and fall of his sides, could see the old scars crisscrossing his dark hide. Then the boy did something that made the woman gasp. He leaned forward, his face close to the fence, and he began to move his lips. Not speaking exactly, because the sounds that came out were soft and formless, the vocalizations of someone who'd never heard language. But it was clear he was trying to communicate something. His hands lifted and he began to sign, his small fingers forming shapes against the air. The stallion lowered his head. Slowly, carefully, he brought his muzzle to the fence, separated from the boy's face by only the width of the metal rail. They stayed like that, the condemned horse and the deaf child, locked in a moment of silent communion that seemed to exist outside of time. Jack felt something in his chest tighten, a painful pressure that might have been grief or wonder, or the sudden terrible understanding that he was about to make a decision that would change everything. The boy pulled back finally, turning to his mother. He signed something to her, his hands moving with urgent emphasis. The woman's eyes widened, then filled with tears. She looked up at Jack, and her voice trembled when she spoke. "He says the horse isn't mean. He says he's just scared and lonely, and no one's been listening to him. He says he can hear what the horse is saying, even though he can't hear anything else. And he's asking if we can save him." Jack ran a hand over his face, feeling every one of his 53 years pressing down on him. He looked at the horse, who was still standing at the fence, his eyes fixed on the boy with an expression that looked almost hopeful. He looked at the kid, who was watching him with a quiet faith that someone would finally do the right thing. And he thought about all the animals he'd processed through this place, all the lives that had ended here, because no one had time or resources or patience to see past their fear to the creature suffering underneath. "I can't just give him to you," Jack said slowly. "There are liability issues, legal procedures. He's been deemed dangerous by multiple authorities. If I release him and he hurts someone, it's on me. It could shut down this whole operation." "What if we took full responsibility?" the woman asked. "What if I signed whatever you needed, releasing you in the county from any liability? What if I promised to keep him contained, to never put him in a situation where he could hurt anyone?" "Where would you even keep him?" Jack asked, though he could already feel his resistance crumbling. "You have facilities, experience." "My brother has a small farm about 10 miles outside town," she said. 5 acres, mostly unused. He said we could use it if we ever wanted to get a horse for my son. I've worked with horses before, when I was younger. I'm not a professional, but I know enough to be careful. And I'll find help. I'll reach out to trainers, to rescue organizations, whatever it takes. Jack was quiet for a long time, weighing responsibility against mercy, rules against what felt undeniably right. Finally, he said, "Let me make some calls. I'm not promising anything, but let me see what I can do." The next hours were a blur of phone calls and paperwork, of convincing skeptical officials and finding legal loopholes. The rescue organization that had surrendered the stallion was shocked, but ultimately agreed, relieved to avoid the guilt of euthanizing an animal without exhausting every possibility. The county vet was harder to convince, but when Jack described what he'd witnessed, something in his voice must have carried weight, because the vet finally sighed and agreed to delay the execution pending a 30-day evaluation period. If the horse showed improvement, if he could be safely handled, he could be released to the woman's care. If not, the original decision would stand. By late afternoon, the paperwork was signed. The woman, whose name was Helen Leonord, stood outside the main office with tears running freely down her face. Her son, whose name was Danny, stood beside her, holding her hand, looking more peaceful than he had all day. Jack had one condition. Before the horse left the kill pen, he needed to be loaded into a trailer, and given his history, that meant sedation. No one was risking an injury during transport. The county vet arrived as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, turning the sky shades of amber and rose. Danny stood at the fence while the vet prepared the sedative, a mild dose meant to calm without fully knocking the horse out. The stallion was agitated again, pacing his pen, his head high and his eyes showing white. "This is going to be difficult," the vet muttered, eyeing the horse. "He's not going to let me get close enough for an injection. We might need to use a dart." But Danny was already moving. He slipped through the gate before anyone could stop him, before his mother could grab him, before Jack could shout a warning. He walked into the pen with the condemned horse, his small body moving with absolute confidence, and every adult watching felt their heart stop. The stallion wheeled toward him, and for one terrible moment, it looked like he would charge, his ears pinned flat, his lips pulled back from his teeth. He was a 1,500-pound weapon, and he was pointing himself directly at a small child who couldn't even hear the pounding of hooves that might be coming. But Danny didn't run. He didn't freeze. He simply stopped walking and held out his hand, palm up, in a gesture of offering, and he began to sign. His hands moved through the air in shapes and patterns that held meaning only for him, and perhaps for the animal watching him. His lips moved, making those soft, formless sounds that were the closest he could come to speech. The stallion's charge never materialized. Instead, he stopped, his whole body shaking with the effort of containing his fear and aggression. He stood 10 feet from the boy, breathing hard, every muscle coiled, and slowly, so slowly it seemed to take forever, he lowered his head. He took one step forward, then another, until he was standing directly in front of Danny. He lowered his muzzle to the boy's outstretched hand and exhaled, a long breath that seemed to carry all the tension out of his body. Danny reached up with his other hand and touched the horse's face. He leaned forward, and in a moment that would replay in Jack's mind for the rest of his life, he whispered directly into the stallion's ear. Not words, because he didn't have words in the way hearing people did, but something. A message passed in that profound silence, from one being who'd been trapped in isolation to another. A promise, perhaps, or simply an acknowledgement that they saw each other, truly saw each other, in ways the world had failed to see either of them. The vet stood frozen, the sedative forgotten in his hand. Helen was crying openly, her hands clasped over her mouth. Jack felt his own eyes burning, and he wasn't ashamed. He'd worked in death long enough to recognize life when he saw it being born. "I don't think we're going to need that sedative," the vet said quietly. "I think that boy just did something I've never seen anyone do before." Danny turned to the gate, and the stallion followed him. Just followed, like a dog trained to heel, his head low and his eyes calm. The boy led him out of the kill pen, through the gate, and directly to the waiting trailer. Without hesitation, without fear, the horse walked up the ramp and into the trailer. Danny gave him one last pat on the shoulder, then stepped back so the vet could raise the door. As the trailer pulled away, heading toward the small farm that would become the horse's new home, Jack stood in the dusty parking lot and watched until it disappeared from view. He thought about all the rules he'd broken, all the procedures he'd bent. He thought about the risk he'd taken, the trust he'd placed in a 6-year-old child and a mother desperate for a miracle. And he thought about the alternative, about what would have happened tomorrow morning if he'd followed protocol, if he'd let fear and liability dictate his actions. Sometimes, he realized, the right thing and the legal thing weren't the same. Sometimes mercy required breaking rules. And sometimes the most profound communication happened in perfect silence, between beings who understood pain and isolation in ways words could never capture. The days that followed were harder than Helen had anticipated. The stallion, whom Danny named Timber for the deep brown of his coat, was physically present but emotionally distant. He allowed Helen to feed him, to clean his stall, but he remained wary of her, his body language closed and defensive. With Danny, however, he was different. The boy would sit in the stall for hours, doing his homework in the hay while Timber stood nearby, gradually relaxing into the child's silent presence. Helen's brother, Edgar, was less enthusiastic about the arrangement than he'd initially suggested. He was a practical man, a farmer who viewed animals as livestock rather than companions. The idea of rehabilitating a dangerous horse seemed foolish to him, a waste of resources they didn't have. But he'd promised his sister the use of his land, and he was a man who kept his word, even when he thought that word had been given unwisely. The real challenges began when Helen tried to find professional help. She called every horse trainer within 50 miles, explaining the situation, asking for guidance. Most refused outright once they heard the horse's history. The few who agreed to visit lasted less than an hour. Timber's behavior with strangers was unchanged. He would pin his ears, bare his teeth, strike at the stall door with his front hooves. One trainer left shaking his head, telling Helen she was going to get her son killed, and she should take the horse back to the kill pen, where he belonged before tragedy struck. Only with Danny did the aggression disappear. The boy would arrive home from school each day, his mother would drive him to the farm, and he would immediately go to Timber's stall. He'd learned to muck it out himself, his small body working the pitchfork with determined effort. He'd brush the horse, starting at the shoulder and working his way back, exactly as Helen had shown him. and he would sit in the hay and sign to the horse, telling him about his day in a language only he knew, a language the horse seemed to understand better than any spoken word. Helen began to learn sign language herself, studying online videos late at night after Danny was asleep. She'd grown up with spoken language, had taken her hearing for granted until Danny was born, and she'd entered a world of silence she'd never imagined. She'd learned basic signs over the years, enough to communicate necessities, but she'd never become fluent. Now she threw herself into it, desperate to understand what her son was saying to the horse, what message was passing between them that created such profound, awe change. One evening, about 3 weeks into Timber's stay at the farm, Helen sat on an overturned bucket outside the stall, watching Danny groom the horse. She signed a question to her son. "What do you say to him when you're alone?" Danny paused in his brushing, considering. Then his hands moved, slowly and deliberately. "I tell him I understand. I tell him the world is loud for everyone else, but for us it's quiet. And quiet isn't bad. Quiet means you can hear the important things, like hearts beating, like trust growing, like fear going away." Helen felt tears prick her eyes. "What does he say back?" Danny smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his usually serious face. His hands moved again. "He doesn't say words, but I can feel what he means. He's saying thank you. He's saying he was so scared for so long. He's saying he thought no one would ever understand. And then I came. And now he's not alone anymore." "You're not alone either," Helen signed back. "You know that, right?" Danny nodded, but there was something in his expression that suggested he didn't quite believe it. He'd spent 6 years in a world where communication was always a struggle, where he was always slightly outside the circle of easy conversation, where he read lips and watched faces and tried to make his awkward vocalizations understood by people who didn't have the patience to truly listen. With Timber, there was no struggle. There was only pure understanding, unfiltered by language or sound. The breakthrough came on a cold morning in late October. The 30-day evaluation period was nearly over, and the county vet was scheduled to visit to assess Timber's progress. If the horse showed continued aggression, if he was deemed unsafe, the original decision would be reinstated. Helen had barely slept in days, terrified that they'd lose him, that Danny would lose the one companion who truly understood him. The vet arrived with Jack Pugsley in tow. Jack had insisted on being present, partly out of professional obligation and partly because he needed to see how this story ended. They stood outside the stall, watching as Danny worked with Timber. The horse stood calmly while the boy brushed him, his head low, his eyes half closed in contentment. It was a complete transformation from the animal they'd seen in the kill pen. "I need to approach him," the vet said quietly. "I need to verify that this change is real, not just specific to the child." Helen's stomach clenched with anxiety. "He doesn't do well with strangers. He's still very defensive." "I understand," the vet said. "But if he can't be handled by anyone except a 6-year-old boy, he's not safe. That's the reality." Helen signed to Danny, explaining what was about to happen. The boy's face grew serious, then determined. He turned to Timber and placed both hands on the horse's neck. He leaned close and whispered into his ear again, that same soundless communication that seemed to carry more meaning than words ever could. Then he stepped back and nodded to the vet. The vet entered the stall slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening. Timber's head came up immediately, his ears pinned back, his body tensed, muscles coiling in preparation for fight or flight. The vet froze, his hand extended but not touching, waiting to see what the horse would do. For a moment, it seemed like all the progress might shatter. Timber took one step back, then another, his eyes showing white, his breathing rapid and shallow. He was on the edge of panic, on the verge of the explosive violence that had characterized his behavior for so long. But Danny stepped forward. He placed himself between the vet and the horse, and he began to sign. His hands moved urgently, shapes and patterns flowing together in a language of pure meaning. And Timber watched. His eyes locked on the boy's hands, following the movements as if reading text. Slowly, impossibly, the tension began to drain from his body. His ears came forward, his breathing slowed. He looked at the vet again, and this time there was assessment rather than fear in his gaze. Danny stepped aside and gestured to the vet to continue. The man moved forward, his hand reaching toward Timber's shoulder. The horse allowed the touch. allowed the vet to run his hand down the powerful neck, to check his teeth, to examine the old scars and injuries. Timber stood quietly through it all, occasionally glancing at Danny as if seeking reassurance, but never threatening, never aggressive. When the examination was finished, the vet stepped out of the stall and released a breath he'd been holding. "I don't know how to explain what I just saw," he said, looking at Jack and then at Helen. "That horse should not be that calm. His history, his trauma, the ingrained fear and aggression, it should take years to overcome that, if it can be overcome at all." "But he is calm," Helen said. "You saw it. He's changed." "With the boy present, yes," the vet acknowledged. "But long-term, that's a dependency that could be problematic. What happens when the boy is at school, when he grows up and moves away? Will the horse regress? Or," Jack said quietly, "what if that boy taught him something that will last? What if he gave him a foundation of trust that he can build on?" The vet was quiet for a long moment, watching Danny, who had returned to Timber's side and was scratching the horse behind the ear with unself-conscious affection. Finally, he nodded. "I'm going to approve his release, but with conditions, regular check-ins, any sign of regression or aggression, any injury to anyone, and he comes back immediately. This is a probationary approval, not a permanent one. Understood?" Helen nodded so hard she felt dizzy. "Understood. Thank you. Thank you so much." As the vet and Jack prepared to leave, Jack pulled Helen aside. "That boy of yours is special," he said. "I've been working with animals my whole life, and I've never seen anything like what he did. You take care of both of them, you hear?" "I will," Helen promised. "I swear I will." The months that followed brought gradual but steady progress. Timber learned to accept Helen's presence, then Edgar's, though he remained wary of strangers. Helen found a local trainer named Ruth who specialized in trauma rehabilitation and was willing to work with them remotely, offering advice and guidance through video calls. Danny continued his daily visits, and the bond between boy and horse deepened into something that seemed to transcend the normal limits of human-animal connection. Helen watched her son change as well. He became more confident, more willing to engage with the world. At school, he made his first real friend, another child who learned basic signs just to communicate with him. His teachers reported that he was participating more in class, raising his hand, contributing in ways he never had before. It was as if Timber had given him proof that he could be understood, that his way of communicating had value, that silence wasn't isolation if someone was truly listening. The local newspaper got wind of the story and ran a feature article. The headline read, "Silent Communication, How a Deaf Child Saved a Condemned Horse." The article brought unexpected attention, including donations to the local therapeutic writing program and inquiries from researchers studying animal-human communication. Helen politely declined most of the interest, protective of her son's privacy and wary of turning their private miracle into a public spectacle. But she did agree to speak at a fundraiser for the county rescue organization, the same one that had initially surrendered Timber. She stood at the podium, looking out at a room full of animal advocates and donors, and she told their story. She talked about the kill pen, about the boy who couldn't hear but could understand, about the horse who'd been written off as hopeless. And she talked about what it meant to truly listen, to set aside assumptions and fear, and see the being underneath the trauma. "My son can't hear," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "But he taught me that hearing isn't the only way to understand. Sometimes we get so caught up in the noise of words and sounds that we miss the real communication happening underneath." That horse was screaming for help for years, but everyone was too afraid of his anger to hear his pain. Danny heard it because he wasn't listening with his ears. He was listening with his heart. The speech received a standing ovation, and the fundraiser exceeded its goal by 3 times. But the real victory came 2 days later, when Helen received a call from Jack Pugsley. The kill pen operation, he told her, was implementing new protocols. Before any animal was put down, they would spend additional time evaluating behavioral issues, would reach out to specialized trainers, would consider alternative interventions. It wasn't perfect, but it was change, born from one boy's refusal to accept that some lives were disposable. On a warm evening in late spring, nearly 6 months after Timber's rescue, Helen stood at the fence of Edgar's farm and watched Danny ride the horse for the first time. They'd worked up to this moment slowly, so slowly that Edgar had grumbled about the waste of time. But Ruth had insisted that trust couldn't be rushed, that Timber needed to choose to carry Danny, not be forced into it. And finally, the day had come. Danny sat bareback on Timber's broad back, his small hands tangled in the black mane, his face alight with pure joy. Timber walked carefully around the small paddock, his movements gentle and measured, constantly aware of the precious cargo he carried. They moved together in perfect silence, the deaf child and the once violent horse, and in that silence was more communication than 1,000 words could contain. Helen thought about all the people who'd said this was impossible, the trainers who'd refused to help, the officials who'd wanted to put Timber down, even Edgar standing beside her now, who'd thought this was foolish. They'd all been wrong because they'd measured possibility by the wrong standards. They'd looked at a traumatized horse and seen only danger. They'd looked at a deaf child and seen only limitation. They'd missed what Danny had seen from the very beginning, two beings who understood pain and isolation, who spoke the same language of survival and hope, who could heal each other if given the chance. "I was wrong," Edgar said quietly, breaking into her thoughts. "I thought you were crazy. I thought you were going to get Danny hurt, but look at him. I haven't seen him smile like that since before his father left." Helen nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Danny's father had left when the boy was 2, unable to cope with the challenges of raising a deaf child, unwilling to learn a new language or adjust his expectations. His loss, Helen had told herself repeatedly over the years. His loss. But she knew Danny had felt the abandonment deeply, had internalized the message that he was too difficult, too different, too much work. Timber had shown him something different, had shown him that his way of being in the world wasn't wrong or less than, had shown him that silence could be strength, that being different could be a gift, that the right connections didn't require you to change everything about yourself. As the sun set over the farm, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Danny slid off Timber's back and wrapped his arms around the horse's neck. Timber lowered his head, resting his muzzle on the boy's shoulder, and they stood there together, two survivors who'd found each other in the darkest moment and chosen to walk toward the light. Helen took out her phone and captured the image, not for social media or newspapers, but for Danny, for the day when he was older and might doubt himself, might forget what he was capable of, might need a reminder that he'd once saved a life simply by refusing to accept that some things couldn't be saved. The years ahead would bring challenges. Timber would never be a completely social horse, would always be wary of strangers, would carry his trauma like old scars that ached in bad weather. Danny would face struggles of his own, navigating a hearing world that didn't always have the patience to meet him halfway. But they would face those challenges together, boy and horse, bound by a silence that spoke louder than any words, by an understanding that transcended the limits of language. In a world that measured worth by productivity and value by market price, they were proof of something else, that every life had meaning. That brokenness wasn't the end of the story, that sometimes the most profound healing came from the most unexpected places. That communication wasn't about sound or words, but about being truly seen, truly heard, truly understood by another being who recognized your pain because they carried their own. And that sometimes, just sometimes, all it took to save a life was the willingness to listen in the silence, to see past the fear to the terrified creature underneath, to believe that connection was possible even when every logical assessment said it wasn't. All it took was a deaf child who understood that the most important things were never spoken aloud, and a condemned horse who'd been waiting his entire life for someone to finally, truly hear him. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that miracles happen in the quietest moments and that every life has value worth fighting for, please subscribe to our channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of hope, healing, and the extraordinary bonds that remind us what it means to be truly alive.